YouTube, what's up? Back again for another daily fishing video here on Andrew Upshaw Fishing. Guys, today we're going to talk about gear ratios and how to pick the proper technique for each one. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a real big change in gear ratios. We've seen some really slow ones. I remember when I was younger, when I was first starting out, Shimano used to make one that was a 3:8:1 gear ratio for cranking, and that was the reel that we used. And I remember using it one time, and I'm like, I can't fish like this. It was so slow. And then the 5:1s and the 6:3:1s. And that's basically what we used for a long time, was a 6:3:1. That was considered a fast reel. But now we have 7:1s, we have 8:1s, and we even have 9:1 gear ratio reels. And so today we're going to talk about techniques and how to pick the right reel for your situation. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you flat out, no questions asked, anything below a 6:8:1 and above a 7:5:1 is what I consider a specialty gear ratio. This isn't a reel that I feel like you need a dozen of or 2 dozen of or anything like that. This is a reel that you might need 1 or 2 or 3 or something like that, depending on the type of fisherman you are and the type of techniques that you fish the most, or kind of where you're at in the country for that matter. But let's talk about the most extreme. The most extreme, what I would consider, is a 9:1. This is the Hyperspeed Lose reel. This is a 9, I think it's a 9.2:1. Got the box right here. I mean, it is super duper 9.5:1. I'm wrong. 9.5:1. It's super fast. And honestly, for a reel like this, I'm literally using it for one technique, and that's it. And that's the only technique I'm using that for, is flipping. When it comes to 9:1, more times than not, you're going to be cranking your bait too fast if you're throwing a bait that dives under the water. I guess technically you can fish a worm with it, but for me, the way I fish a worm, I'm always using my reel handle, and I feel like it would honestly pull the bait up off the bottom too much if I'm fishing a bait that's on the bottom. And so in this situation, where I would use is where I would flip out, I'd engage my reel. If one ate it and was coming to me, I could reel and catch him and hit him the right way. If you use a slower gear ratio, so that's why I'm not going to use like a 6:8:1 flipping, because when I go to engage that reel, that fish is already out here, and it's going to take me 5 or 6 cranks to actually get that hook set. And that 9.5:1, I can just hit them immediately, just about. So it really, you see a big benefit when it comes to flipping using that really fast reel. Now, on an 8.3:1 or an 8.1:1, depending on the brand that you use, there's a couple of different techniques that I use for that. I'll frog with that reel, because a lot of times, once again, I'm sitting there frogging. If a fish comes up there and eats it, it only takes me about 2 cranks to get them, get that line tight and get the hook set, because that's a really important aspect of it. You don't want to just set the hook on super slack line and expect to land that fish, especially if you're in heavy cover, like lily pads or grass or something like that. So you want that 8:1 in that situation. I also, once again, like it for flipping, but you can also use an 8:1 for a lot of different things too. You can drag baits on the bottom. Once again, though, for me, it makes baits lift more because I use my reel to engage. And whenever you're sitting there and you're worming and you're reeling, it's just going to be doing this through the water column. So 9 times out of 10, when it comes to the right gear ratio for me, I use a 7.5:1 gear ratio. This is just a great in-between. It's going to give you that real quick, 2 or 3 crank to catch up with a fish if they hit it. But it's also slow enough that if I really slow my reel handle down, I can slow a bait down. And that's really important. Like if you're throwing chatterbaits or, a vibrating jig, a swim jig, things like that, you need to crawl it. You can really slow that down. In the case of a 9.5:1, even me going slow is still really fast. And so I can't really slow the reel down based off the way that I move my hand. Now, 7.5:1, you can use spinner baits, chatter baits, topwater. That is my topwater reel. The only reason I don't like an 8.1:1 or an 8.5:1 or anything faster with the topwater is I already have a tendency to fish it too fast as it is. And so therefore it makes me slow it down just a little bit by going to that 7.5:1. And sometimes really paying attention to that and slowing that bait down is really important. I also use all 7.5 to 1s on worms, jigs, anything I'm crawling or casting that's on the bottom. That is no questions asked, that's what I'm using. And I still will flip with that reel quite a bit as well, just because it's a reel I have a lot of and I really enjoy using it that way. Now, we're going to get back into specialty once you get down below 6.8 to 1. But before we get there, the 6.8 to 1 gear ratio. This is just a KVD reel. It's a new Lew's reel. 6.8 to 1, I actually use a couple of different techniques. Now, you don't hear a lot of guys using a 6.8 to 1 as much as maybe you do a 7.5 to 1 or even an 8.1 to 1. But that 6.8 to 1 gear ratio, I use a couple different things in certain times of the year. So if I'm throwing a spinnerbait, if I'm throwing a chatterbait and I need to slow it way down, that's when I'm going to a 6.8 to 1. I also use a 6.8 to 1 on my single swim bait. So like you'll hear me talking about fishing like a rage swimmer on a ball head. I always throw it on a 6.8 to 1. The only times I will really change is if I do want to keep it up in the water column, I'll go to a 7.5 to 1. But if I'm trying to keep it on the bottom, I'm going to throw a 6.8 to 1. I will also crank with a 6.8 to 1. Yeah, you heard that right. I like to crank with a 6.8 to 1 in certain times of the year. And it's typically in the summertime, mid to late summer. And that is when I'm turning to that 6.8 to 1 or throwing a square bill crankbait. Once again, cranking it, I can slow it down. And if I need to speed it up, I can just crank faster and I can get to that gear ratio of like a 7.5 to 1 just by how fast I spin my hand. Now, the last specialty gear ratio that I'm going to talk about is a 5.1 to 1, which would, in this situation, would be like a BB1, a Lew's BB1. I have used a Lew's BB1 since its inception. I mean, it's just a really good cranking reel. That is the only thing I do with it. At one point, I attempted to try to fish a spinnerbait with it, but the only problem I found was fishing a spinnerbait with a 5.1 to 1. And there's certain times a year you want to throw that big thumper blade with that real slow reel, was I couldn't quite catch up to fish. So if I hit them and they were running at me or running to the side, I couldn't get that hook really driven like I needed to catch up with them. And it cost me a few fish. And ever since then, I've just kind of turned my back on it and gone to that 6.8 to 1. But that 5.1 to 1 I use for a couple different techniques. It's all cranking related. But this time of year, like the winter time, I'm cranking with a 5.1 to 1. Want to be able to slow that bait down the best I can, like a 6XD, something like that, but also a flat-sided crankbait. I can't stress to you enough how important it is to slow that flat-sided crankbait down, like a Chick Magnet or Chick Magnet Junior, or even like a Shad Rap or something like a number 7 Shad Rap, and reeling it really slow. Another sleeper bait that I fish with it is the KVD Flat, which is a little bit deeper diving crankbait, but it's a flat side, zero sound. And I always throw it on a 5.1 to 1. Now, granted, I'm going to tell you that bait's really hard to cast. And when you throw lighter baits like the Shad Rap or even that KVD Flat, they're really hard to cast on a 5.1 to 1 or even any bait casting reel. But you just got to take your time and cast it out there, and you will catch a lot of fish. I've caught some really, really big ones on that KVD Flat with that 5.1 to 1 gear ratio. But paying attention to how fast you're fishing or how slow you're fishing is really important, and that will help you determine what reel is going to be best for that situation. Now, this isn't the maiden science version of this. This is just the way that I've approached picking my gear ratio reels over the course of time. And I'm going to tell you guys, if you pay attention to this and you kind of buy your reels based off of how you fish, like if you're a big-time deep cranker, it's really important to have a 5.1 to 1 and a 6.8 to 1, and even a 7.5 to 1, depending on the speed of which you're having to crank your bait. If you're a worm dragger, you can just get away with a 7.5 to 1 all the time. But if you're a flipper or frogger, 8 to 1, 9 to 1, definitely going to be the way to go. But guys, if y'all have any questions, make sure you drop them in the comment section below. I hope this will help you when you decide to buy a new reel. And if you have any questions on the Lew's reels that I talked about, whether it be the Hyperspeed, the KVD, or the brand new Pro TI, just let me know. Drop them in the comments. Guys, if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do so. It's in the bottom right-hand corner. Just hit that sub button. I will be here all year long. So y'all better be ready for 2023. We're going to have a lot of big things coming. And until next time, I'll see you on the next video.